The year was 146 BC, and the Mediterranean awoke to the smell of smoke and blood. Two cities, two of the world's most glorious metropolises, lay in ruins, their population slain, their temples plundered, and their nations subjugated. Those cities were Carthage and Corinth, and they have long and illustrious histories of their own. But today we will be discussing the city that obliterated them both. The Romans had come a long way since the Republic's founding in 509. First came Italy, then its outlying islands, and before long Rome had an overseas empire stretching from Spain to Greece. But, as the Romans would soon find out, owning an empire was nearly as dangerous as building one, and the Republic began its slow descent into crisis. The Romans began to discover that victory was a double-edged sword. Even as triumphs were being held for victorious generals and the war-weary troops finally returned home, the Republic began to groan under the weight of its conquests. Mountains of foreign treasure were hauled back from the fresh conquests, most of which went to the small group of powerful Roman nobles who gobbled up most of the spoils of war. Not everyone was quite so filthily rich though, as the returning legionaries soon found out. Those same soldiers who revelled in the bawdy songs of the triumphs began filtering out of Rome to find their farms in ruin. Service in the legions, you see, was based on property requirements, so only men who owned farms and thus could afford equipment were permitted to serve as heavy infantry. The problem here is that all the men who should have been working their farms had been busy slogging it out overseas. Previously this hadn't been such an issue because the wars had been localised to Italy, but now that Roman armies were fighting on 3 continents, the cracks in this system began to show. Many miles from home, the soldiers' farms and livelihoods collapsed as the armies spent many seasons overseas. As a result, the destitution of the citizen farmers forced many of them to sell their property to the newly enriched nobility, often remaining on as mere tenant farmers. In other cases, they could not even find employment on these rapidly growing estates, since the large quantity of foreign slaves injected into Italy meant that most free Romans were driven out of work. In short, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, resulting in an increasingly acute dislocation of Rome's lower classes. It was into these conditions of widening inequality that Tiberius Gracchus first stepped into the fold. From birth, Tiberius seemed set for greatness. His family's fortunes had improved with each generation, and his father had won 2 triumphs and 2 consulships. His mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, and commanded considerable influence within the Scipione clan. But young Tiberius himself was remarkable for his unbending integrity, superb rhetorical skills, and keen intellect. Although his father died when he was young, his mother, Cornelia, worked tirelessly to see him and his younger brother Gaius moulded into the greatest Romans of tomorrow, and provided them with first-class education from the finest Greek orators. Like all future politicians, he was sent to serve in the legions and got his first taste of conflict in the Third Punic War, serving under his brother-in-law Scipio Aemilianus. He performed well as a soldier and won an award for being the first man over the Carthaginian fortifications. Upon his return, his mother secured his marriage to the daughter of Appius Claudius Pulcher, one of Rome's preeminent politicians. Intelligent, upright and well-connected, nothing, it seemed, could stop him now. Had you told anyone that, just over a decade later, Tiberius would be slaughtered in the street and dumped in the Tiber, they probably would have laughed in your face. In 137 he was elected as quaestor and was dispatched to serve under consul Hostilius Mancinus in Spain. The Romans had found themselves stuck in a grueling guerrilla war against various Celtiberian tribes for 6 years now, and progress had slowed to a halt, as the city of Numantia stoutly rebuffed any attempts to take it by storm. As the man in charge, Mancinus wasn't a very competent general, and soon enough the Romans found themselves surrounded by an enemy army. Gracchus's father had hammered out a peace with the Numantines some years prior, and his name still commanded respect with them. So young Tiberius was called upon to negotiate with the Numantines. Their filial faith was not misplaced, and Tiberius was able to secure peace and safe passage for the 30,000 legionaries. And his reward for saving those lives, you ask? To be bollocked by the old men of the Senate. They were furious at the supposed insult to Roman honour, and poor consul Mancinus was stripped of office and dumped outside Numantia. The Senate rejected the peace wholeheartedly. The war carried on. Tiberius could nevertheless feel some measure of pride in the glowing support of the families of the soldiers he had saved, and upon his return he got involved with the project that would ultimately cost him his life. Some time prior to this, Tiberius had become more aware of the plight facing the poorer citizens, and resolved to do something about it. The crux of his life was an ambitious law called the Lex Agraria. The gist of it revolved around ager publicus, or public land. Rome converted a third of conquered Italian land into ager publicus, which for the most part was rented out to people in return for some of the profits. To prevent the rich from hogging all the land, a restriction was put in place prohibiting any one family from holding more than 1.26 square kilometres of land. However, the Senate was stacked with wealthy landowners, so asking them to self-police themselves was pretty much hopeless, and the rich regularly held way over the limit. What the Lex Agraria planned to do was to strictly enforce this limit and confiscate anything over 1.26 square kilometres. Any lands confiscated would then be redistributed to the Roman farmers, with the aims of restoring their livelihoods. To ensure that the wealthy couldn't just gobble up all the land again, these farmers were prohibited from selling their new plots. In this way, its proponents attempted to reverse the problems facing Italy and restore, at least to some extent, the economic health of Rome's citizens. Prior to Tiberius's involvement, several senatorial heavy hitters were involved in the formation of the law, including Tiberius's father-in-law Appius Claudius Pulcher, the Princeps Senatus. The men in support of his bill were some of the brightest legal minds in Rome, but they knew this wouldn't be an easy task. Opposition to the bill would be fierce, and this was for two main reasons. One, rich people don't like having their stuff taken off them, and, perhaps more saliently, the fact that whoever was able to pull off this law and ensure the transfer of all this land would suddenly gain the support and adoration of thousands of citizen farmers, a massive shift in the political balance of power, and an indication that perhaps not everyone involved in the bill, especially grandees such as Claudius Pulcher, was in it out of such high-minded idealism. As is often the case with Roman history, events overseas finally put events into motion. The Numantine War rumbled on after the Senate's rejection of peace, and the people were getting fed up. So they turned to Scipio Aemilianus, the hero of Carthage, to put an end to Numantia's dogged resistance, and elected him as consul in 134. Aemilianus may have been Tiberius's brother-in-law, but he was quite conservative and was on bad terms with Claudius Pulcher, so his opposition to the bill could be counted on. But now that he was on his way to Spain, Claudius saw an opportunity to attack, and sent his skilled son-in-law Tiberius to introduce the law. Tiberius was elected as tribune of the plebs in 134 and hoped to use his new position to vault back to the forefront of Roman politics, especially after the battering he had got during the Numantine scandal. The reformists put out feelers to take the temperature of the room, but the senators were aghast. They tried to compromise with the rich by adding clauses to the bills that gave privileges to certain families, and so on and so forth. However, it was becoming clear to all that senatorial opposition to the bill was wholesale, so the reformists took the provocative step of ignoring the Senate entirely and putting the bill directly before the Assembly. There was no law saying that this was illegal, but it just wasn't done. The shock of the Senate notwithstanding, the Lex Agraria struck a chord with the dispossessed Romans of Italy, who now flooded into the city in droves to vote for the bill. As the cheering crowds gathered, Tiberius gave speeches day in day out to shore up support for the bill, and in doing so he demonstrated his outstanding rhetorical skill. Standing perfectly still, he never allowed himself to get worked up, allowing the weight of his arguments to impress themselves upon his listeners. Tiberius addressed the massed spectators thusly: "The wild beasts that roam Italy have every one of them a cave or lair to lurk in, while the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy the common air and light, but nothing else. Houseless and homeless, they wander about with their wives and children. It is with lying lips that their commanders exhort the soldiers to fight battles to protect sepulchres and shrines from the enemy, but they fight and die in support of others in wealth and luxury. Though they are styled as masters of the world, they have not a single clod of earth to call their own." The crowd was brought to tears, and Tiberius could finally take a sigh of relief, knowing that he had performed superbly and ensured the bill's passage into law. But his enemies had not been idle. Suddenly, as the law was being read out in full, Marcus Octavius, a tribune of the plebs that had been co-opted by his enemies, showed up and vetoed the proceedings. Seeing that Octavius was not going to back down, Tiberius gritted his teeth and called an end to proceedings as nighttime shrouded the city in darkness. The break of dawn brought only increased tensions. The reformists decided to take a harder line, removing all compromises from the bill and trying to villainize the rich in an attempt to pressure Octavius into retreating. Octavius stayed put, so the two tribunes continued to spar verbally with one another, each becoming more heated as things went. Tiberius then ratcheted things up a notch by threatening to veto every piece of public business unless Octavius retracted his veto. Once again, Octavius refused, so Tiberius locked the state treasury with his personal seal. As things became more and more heated, the Senate offered to mediate, and by mediate what I actually mean is to light up Tiberius with torrents of abuse. Octavius was flagrantly acting against the will of the people, and Tiberius's patience finally snapped. So he took the dramatic step of inducing the assembly to depose Octavius from the tribunate. If a tribune was so clearly opposing the will of the people, Tiberius asked, what right did he have to be a tribune? The answer he got back was a resounding no. The tribes voted unanimously to depose Octavius from office. Octavius was stubborn but not suicidal, and he elected not to veto the vote. With no one standing in his way, the vote went ahead and the Lex Agraria passed with overwhelming numbers. Tiberius had won, but at what cost? The choice to bypass the Senate and depose Octavius using the will of the people had alienated many of the more moderate reformists and left the stink of illegitimacy around the bill. Furthermore, it ran roughshod over the Mos Maiorum, the so-called ways of the elders, leaving another black mark against his name and setting a bad precedent for the future. Tiberius had won the battle, but not the war. He wasn't out of the woods yet. Opposition from the Conservatives in the Senate was stiff, and they were determined to frustrate the implementation of the Lex Agraria at every step. But that, along with the fight of Tiberius's life, is for the second part of this story.